A low gray light spreads across the coast of Normandy, filtered through smoke, salt spray, and drifting cordite. The sea is restless. Landing craft grind forward in uneven lines, their metal hulls rattling under machine gun fire and exploding shells. Men crouch inside, faces pale, hands locked around rifles, slick with seawater. Some pray, some stare straight ahead. On the beaches, boats fall, then disappear beneath the tide. Engineers move anyway. Medics crawl anyway. Infantry keeps advancing, even when units dissolve into fragments of men and smoke. De y continue. From nearby command posts and offshore vessels, Allied observers watch through binoculars. They are watching the largest amphibious assault in history unfold in real time. What they see this morning will challenge assumptions formed over 5 years of war and force admissions that will only come later, once the scale of what is happening becomes impossible to ignore. By the summer of 1944, Britain was not new to war. It had been fighting almost continuously since September 1939, and the experience had left deep marks on its military culture. British commanders who watched the Normandy landings carried with them memories of early disaster, hard-earned survival, and campaigns where caution had often been the price of endurance. The shock of Dunkirk in 1940 still shaped British thinking. The evacuation saved the army, but it also reinforced a lesson that would echo through the next 4 years. Manpower was finite, and losses could not be replaced easily. Britain had avoided annihilation, but it had done so by retreat, not by overwhelming force. That reality never disappeared from the minds of senior officers. In North Africa, British forces learned how to fight a modern, mechanized enemy under harsh conditions. Victories against Axis forces were hard-fought and incremental. Success came through planning, preparation, and grinding pressure rather than sudden, catastrophic blows. The British Army refined an approach that favored set-piece battles, heavy artillery preparation, and tight control from the top. It was effective at deliberate. The campaign up the peninsula was slow, costly, and unforgiving. Terrain favored the defender. German units withdrew in stages, forcing the Allies to pay for every ridge and river crossing. British commanders learned again that frontal assaults against prepared positions could bleed an army dry. Progress was measured in miles, sometimes in yards, and paid for in weeks. Operations were designed to minimize risk, preserve trained units, and avoid uncontrolled momentum. Coordination mattered more than speed. Precision mattered more than shock. This was not timidity to a survival logic forged under pressure. At the strategic level, Britain's position was also different from that of its American ally. The British Empire was still fighting globally. Forces were tied down in the Mediterranean, in Asia, and in the defense of imperial commitments. Industrial output, though formidable, could not match the explosive growth taking place across the Atlantic. Every loss carried political and military consequences that could not be ignored. Their planning reflected a belief that wars were won not just by courage, but by conservation of men, equipment, and morale. A failed offensive was not merely a setback. It was a wound Britain might not have the strength to absorb twice. This perspective shaped how British commanders viewed the coming invasion of Western Europe. An amphibious assault across the English Channel against a fortified coast, defended by experienced German formations, represented the most dangerous operation imaginable. It was precisely the kind of battle Britain had learned to fear since 1940. As a result, British planning emphasized overwhelming preparation. The goal was not dramatic speed, but controlled expansion. Aboith? Catastrophe. Yet Normandy would not be fought by Britain alone. Alongside British and Canadian troops stood a force whose wartime experience, industrial base, and psychological relationship with risk were fundamentally different. American divisions were arriving in numbers Britain had never been able to field at once. British commanders understood this in theory. On June 6, 1944, they would see it demonstrated in blood and motion. The contrast between Britain's learned caution and America's emerging approach to mass speed and sacrifice began to reveal itself not as an abstract debate, but as a reality playing out on the beaches of Normandy. Yet the scale at which it now operated had already begun to reshape the coalition. Two British commanders observing the invasion, The American presence was not merely an addition of troops, it was the arrival of a fundamentally different kind of military power. The transformation had begun after December 1941. American industry shifted with a speed that stunned even its allies. Shipyards, aircraft plants, and vehicle factories expanded beyond anything Britain had experienced during its longer struggle. Where Britain had learned to fight efficiently under constraint, the United States prepared to fight expansively, assuming that losses could be replaced and momentum sustained. This difference was visible long before June 1944. American divisions arrived in Britain fully equipped. The underlying assumption was simple: continuous pressure would eventually overwhelm the enemy. British officers took note. Some were impressed, others were cautious. Experience had taught them that war punished optimism. The British Army had survived by limiting exposure, by shaping battles before committing fully. American planning, by contrast, appeared willing to accept disorder in the early stages if it produced decisive results later. Normandy would test these philosophies under the harshest conditions possible. The American sector of the invasion front stretched across beaches that would soon be known by codenames Utah and Omaha. These were not symbolic labels. Entire divisions would be landed in a single day, followed by waves of armor, artillery, and supplies. Behind the assault troops stood a logistical apparatus unlike anything Britain had previously coordinated. Thousands of ships and landing craft, vast stocks of ammunition, fuel, and rations, and a replacement pipeline designed to absorb casualties without halting operations. American planning did not assume a clean landing. This approach unsettled some British commanders. The memory of failed amphibious operations lingered. It was an invasion designed to sustain itself under fire. Yet American confidence was not blind. It was rooted in production figures, shipping and training cycles that suggested losses, however severe, could be absorbed. This confidence shaped behavior at every level. From staff planning to frontline execution, units were expected to keep moving forward, even when cohesion broke down. For British officers watching from command ships and headquarters, this was unfamiliar ground. British doctrine emphasized maintaining unit integrity, preserving command structure, and advancing according to plan. What they were now witnessing was a system built to function even when plans unraveled. As reports came in from the beaches, the contrast sharpened. Momentum, once established, was not surrendered. This was not recklessness, and for British commanders, it forced a reassessment of assumptions formed over years of war fought under scarcity. By the end of June 6th, it was clear that the invasion had succeeded in establishing a foothold. But the deeper significance lay not only in the beaches secured, it lay in the method by which they had been taken. What British commanders were seeing was not simply American bravery. The implications of that realization would only become clearer as the campaign expanded inland, and as observation turned into judgment. For British commanders, the first and most unsettling realization after June 6th was not tactical or technical. It was human. Britain had learned, through bitter experience, to fear casualties, not only for their immediate cost, but for what they represented long-term. Trained infantrymen, junior officers, engineers, these were assets that could not be replaced quickly. British formations were built around cohesion, experience, and continuity. Heavy losses risked hollowing out units faster than they could be rebuilt. On the Normandy beaches, British observers saw American units endure losses that would have triggered operational pauses in earlier British campaigns. Men were cut down in the surf. Landing craft were hit before ramps dropped. Platoons fragmented almost immediately under fire. And yet, the assault continued. Reports filtering back to headquarters described scenes that were stark but consistent. American troops reorganizing on the beach under fire. Junior leaders assuming command when officers fell, and units pressing inland even when original objectives were missed or leaders killed. Losses did not stop the movement. They were absorbed into it. This was not indifference to life. It was a different calculation. American doctrine assumed that momentum, once broken, would cost more lives in the long run than pressing forward through chaos. British commanders understood the logic, but many had never seen it applied on such a scale. In private assessments, British officers noted that American formations did not withdraw to regroup as readily as British units had been trained to do. They adapted forward. Men who had landed in one unit often fought the first day alongside strangers. The battlefield reorganized itself continuously. For British leaders, shaped by the trauma of early war losses, this willingness to accept disorganization and casualties in pursuit of speed was deeply unsettling. Yet it worked by the end of the day. The beaches were held. Not cleanly, not efficiently, but firmly. And that forced an uncomfortable acknowledgement. The American army was prepared to pay a human price Britain could no longer afford to pay at the same scale. British doctrine prized clarity. Plans were refined, rehearsed, and adjusted until risks were reduced to the lowest possible level. Battles were meant to unfold according to sequence fire movement, consolidation. Deviations were dangerous. Disorder invited disaster. Normandy disrupted that belief. From the first hours of the landings, American operations moved forward, even when plans collapsed. Assault waves landed off course. Units mixed. Timetables failed. German resistance proved stronger than expected in several sectors, yet the response was not to halt and restore order. It was to push through the confusion. British commanders watching this process noted a striking difference in emphasis. American officers appeared less concerned with restoring textbook formations and more focused on maintaining pressure. Tactical eloquence was sacrificed for tempo. If one route was blocked, another was used. If one unit stalled, another pressed forward. This approach clashed with British instincts. Years of fighting had taught British officers that poorly coordinated advances could lead to catastrophic losses. But the Americans were operating under a different assumption. Speed itself was a form of protection. German defenses, once disrupted, could not fully recover if pressure was continuous. In after-action analyses, British staff officers acknowledged that American tempo prevented German commanders from regaining control. Local German counterattacks were launched piecemeal, often before reserves could be assembled. The invasion's success depended not on flawless execution, but on relentless forward motion. What British commanders had once viewed as operational untidiness now appeared, under these conditions, to be a deliberate strength. If the human and tactical differences were unsettling, the logistical reality was overwhelming. British officers had planned complex supply operations throughout the war. They understood logistics as the quiet foundation of every successful campaign. But what unfolded off the Normandy coast exceeded anything they had previously managed. American supply flows did not slow after the first landings. They accelerated. Vehicles, ammunition, fuel, bridging equipment, medical supplies, and replacement troops arrived in quantities that dwarfed British expectations. Temporary harbors, floating roadways, and continuous shipping schedules turned an exposed beachhead into a functioning supply hub within days. British commanders recognized immediately that this level of sustainment changed the nature of operations. Units could remain engaged without lengthy pauses. Losses could be replaced rapidly. Equipment shortages did not dictate tempo in the same way they had in earlier British-led campaigns. In internal discussions, British logisticians acknowledged a hard truth. Britain could plan invasions. America could sustain them indefinitely. The invasion of Normandy was not only a military operation, it was the visible release of American industrial power onto the European continent. Once unleashed, it was difficult to imagine how Germany could stop it short of total collapse. And as British commanders absorbed this reality, observation began to turn into something deeper than analysis. It began to turn into admission. What British commanders found most difficult to categorize was not American equipment or numbers, but American leadership style. British command culture had evolved around hierarchy and experience. Authority flowed downward in clearly defined channels. Orders were precise, and deviation, while sometimes necessary, was treated cautiously. This structure reflected Britain's long professional military tradition and the hard lessons of early war failures. In Normandy, British observers saw something different. American junior officers and non-commissioned officers exercised initiative at levels that surprised their British counterparts. When senior leaders were killed or cut off, command did not freeze. Small unit leaders made decisions independently, often without waiting for clarification from above. The emphasis was not on perfect alignment with the original plan, but on continuing the advance. This flexibility was not accidental. It reflected American training and doctrine, which encouraged decentralized decision-making in combat. British commanders, accustomed to tighter control, initially viewed this as risky. But as the beachhead expanded, it became clear that this adaptability allowed American units to exploit fleeting opportunities and maintain pressure on German defenses. British staff reports noted that American commanders were willing to accept temporary confusion if it produced long-term advantage. This contrasted with British instincts to pause, reorganize, and reassert control before moving forward. In the fluid conditions of Normandy, the American approach often proved faster. Senior British officers did not dismiss this difference. Instead, they studied it. In private correspondence and post-operation reviews, they acknowledged that American command culture matched the scale and pace of the forces it led. Where Britain needed control to conserve strength, America used flexibility to multiply it. The realization was subtle but significant. Leadership styles that would have been dangerous for Britain were effective, perhaps essential for an army operating at American scale. British commanders were not observing the invasion in isolation. They were also watching how the German army responded. German defensive doctrine along the Atlantic Wall relied on containing landings long enough to mount coordinated counterattacks. This required time to identify the main landing zones, time to move reserves, time to concentrate armor. British officers understood this system well. They had studied it carefully. What Normandy revealed was how little time the Germans were being given. American pressure disrupted German command cycles almost immediately. Local commanders launched counterattacks before coordination could be achieved. Reserves were committed piecemeal. Communication broke down under constant air attack and artillery fire. The very speed British commanders had found unsettling was preventing the German defense from stabilizing. British intelligence summaries noted that German units facing American forces reported exhaustion and confusion within days. The scale of the assault created the impression of inexhaustion. German commanders could not easily distinguish between temporary surges and sustained pressure because in Normandy, pressure rarely relented. This had psychological effects. The turning point for British commanders did not arrive with a single order or announcement. It emerged gradually, through field reports, staff briefings, and the undeniable pattern of events unfolding inland from the beaches. In the days after June 6th, the beachhead did not merely survive, it expanded. Despite fierce German resistance, particularly in the Bocage country beyond the landing zones, American forces continued to press forward. Progress was uneven, costly, and often chaotic. But it was continuous. British headquarters began receiving after-action reports that challenged long-held assumptions. American units that had suffered heavy losses on the first day were still operational days later. Fresh formations arrived almost immediately. Equipment losses were replaced with astonishing speed. Where British planners would have expected pauses for reorganization, the American advance maintained pressure. Senior British officers followed these developments closely. Bernard Montgomery, commanding the ground forces for the invasion, had initially emphasized careful expansion of the lodgment area. His intent was to draw German armor toward the British and Canadian sectors, while American forces built strength in the West. Even within this framework, the pace at which American formations regained momentum exceeded expectations. At higher levels, Alan Brooke, monitoring operations from London, studied casualty figures, replacement flows, and operational reports. The numbers were stark. Losses that would have forced Britain to slow operations were being absorbed by the American system with little visible reduction in combat effectiveness. British staff officers began to articulate what they were seeing in more candid terms. Internal memoranda acknowledged that American divisions demonstrated an ability to sustain offensive action under conditions that British units could not replicate without unacceptable risk. This was not criticism, it was recognition. The realization deepened as German counterattacks failed to achieve decisive results. Armament committed against the beachhead was ground down by air power, artillery, and sheer numerical pressure. German commanders found themselves responding to American initiatives rather than shaping the battle themselves. British observers noted that the German army, so formidable in earlier campaigns, was being forced into reactive patterns it could not sustain. By mid-June, the invasion's character was unmistakable. Normandy was no longer a fragile foothold. It was a growing, self-sustaining front. The flow of men and material showed no sign of slowing. Each day increased the imbalance between Allied and German resources. For British commanders, this was the moment when observation hardened into understanding. The success of the invasion did not rest solely on careful planning or tactical finesse. It rested on a capacity for sustained violence and replacement that Britain, by its own assessment, did not possess. This was not a loss of relevance. Britain's contribution remained essential strategically, politically, and militarily, but the center of gravity was shifting. The coalition that had begun the war, under British leadership, was entering a phase in which American power would dominate its execution. And once that reality was acknowledged internally, it shaped every subsequent decision. The most important conclusions drawn by British commanders after Normandy were not delivered in speeches or public statements. They emerged in private diaries, internal assessments, and confidential discussions, places where professional honesty mattered more than national pride. British senior officers began to acknowledge, first among themselves, that the character of the war in Western Europe had changed. The invasion had revealed a form of warfare defined less by maneuver elegance and more by sustained industrial pressure. What had once been considered excessive risk was now producing decisive results. One admission stood out clearly. Britain could not have executed Normandy alone. This was not a criticism of British skill or courage. It was a recognition of scale. The number of divisions landed, the speed at which losses were replaced, and the volume of material delivered across open beaches exceeded Britain's capacity. Even at the height of its wartime mobilization, Britain could not have sustained such an operation without exhausting its manpower reserves. British commanders also acknowledged a difference in tolerance for prolonged offensive strain. The American system was built to keep units in combat, replenishing them continuously rather than withdrawing them for rest and rebuilding. British formations, by contrast, relied on preserving experienced cadre. Once those were lost, effectiveness declined sharply. This led to a sobering internal conclusion. Britain's strength now lay in experience, coordination, and strategic judgment, not in carrying the main weight of attritional ground combat on the continent. Another quiet admission concerned command balance within the alliance. Before Normandy, British officers still viewed themselves as senior partners in planning and operational design. After the landings, it became clear that American forces would increasingly dictate the tempo of the war simply by virtue of their size and momentum. This shift did not produce resentment at the highest levels. Instead, it produced recalibration. British planners began adjusting expectations, focusing on roles where British experience could have the greatest impact: deception operations, complex coordination, and the management of multinational forces, while accepting that the main striking power would come from American formations. There was also an acknowledgement of psychological difference. American troops, many of them new to combat on this scale, had not yet accumulated the cautious instincts that years of attritional warfare had instilled in British soldiers. This lack of hesitation, when combined with overwhelming support, created a relentless forward drive that German defenses struggled to contain. British commanders understood the cost of this approach. Casualties were high. Units suffered deeply, but the results were undeniable. German forces in Normandy were being worn down faster than British planners had anticipated, not through subtle maneuver, but through constant, unavoidable pressure. By late June, these admissions had coalesced into a clear internal understanding. The liberation of Western Europe would be achieved through a coalition, but driven primarily by American industrial and military mass. Britain's role remained vital, but it was no longer dominant. This recognition marked the true turning point, not on the beaches, not in the hedgerows, but in the minds of those responsible for directing the war. From this point forward, Allied strategy would reflect a new reality, one shaped by what British commanders had seen, calculated, and quietly accepted in Normandy. Once the reality of Normandy settled in, its strategic consequences extended far beyond the beachhead. For British commanders, the invasion forced a reassessment, not only of how the war would be fought, but of Britain's position within the Allied effort for the remainder of the conflict. In the weeks following the landings, operational momentum increasingly flowed from the American sectors. As the front expanded, American forces absorbed the bulk of the fighting required to break out of the Normandy. British and Canadian units played crucial roles tying down German armor, conducting major offensives, and sustaining pressure, but the sheer weight of American formations began to shape the overall tempo. British planners recognized that this shift was structural, not temporary. The United States was capable of fielding multiple armies simultaneously, each supported by vast logistical networks. Where Britain had to choose carefully where to commit its strength, America could commit everywhere at once. This altered strategic calculations at every level. The implications were immediate. British commanders adjusted expectations regarding operational leadership. While Britain retained influence in planning and coordination, the execution of large-scale offensives increasingly depended on American capacity. Decisions about timing, axis of advance, and resource allocation reflected this new balance. This recalibration extended to relations within the High Command. Allied cooperation remained close, but the center of gravity had moved. British officers understood that the liberation of Western Europe would be driven by forces whose size and sustainment Britain could not match. The war was no longer constrained by scarcity in the same way it had been in earlier years. There was also a broader recognition that Normandy represented a turning point in modern warfare. Industrial capacity, logistics, and replacement systems had proven as decisive as tactical brilliance. British commanders, many of whom had built their careers on maneuver and economy of force, now faced a battlefield dominated by mass and persistence. This did not diminish Britain as a contribution. British experience remained essential in coordinating complex multinational operations and managing coalition dynamics, but it clarified where British strengths now lay and where they did not. By the time Allied forces pushed beyond Normandy, the strategic direction of the war in the West was set. The question was no longer whether Germany could be defeated, but how quickly. And that timeline was increasingly determined by American capacity to sustain relentless pressure. The invasion had not only opened a second front, it had reshaped the internal logic of the Allied war effort. Beyond strategy and logistics, Normandy left a quieter but lasting impact on British military psychology. For years, British commanders had defined their professionalism through restraint, planning, and efficiency under limitation. These traits had been necessary. They had kept Britain in the war when defeat seemed likely, but after Normandy, those same commanders were forced to confront a reality that was difficult to ignore. Restraint was no longer the dominant currency of victory. Internally, this produced a shift in mindset. British officers did not abandon their principles, but they began to see them differently. Caution, once a survival necessity, was now a limiting factor when operating alongside an ally capable of absorbing losses at scale. Experience, once the decisive advantage, now had to be integrated with overwhelming force rather than relied upon alone. This realization affected training, planning, and post-war thinking. British institutions quietly began studying American methods, not to copy them wholesale, but to understand how leadership, logistics, and decentralization functioned in mass armies. Normandy became a case study in how modern industrial warfare rewarded persistence over perfection. There was also a psychological reckoning. British commanders, many shaped by the trauma of 1940-42, recognized that their instincts had been forged in a different phase of the war. The Americans had entered the conflict later, with fewer scars and greater resources. That difference mattered. It shaped behavior under fire, tolerance for loss, and willingness to press forward when conditions deteriorated. Importantly, this did not breed bitterness. Professional respect replaced earlier skepticism. British officers increasingly described American troops as relentless rather than reckless, adaptable rather than crude. The initial doubts that had existed before Normandy gave way to a sober appreciation of what American power made possible. Institutionally, Britain adjusted to a supporting but still critical role. British command structures focused on coordination, coalition management, and specialized operations areas where experience still provided an edge. The goal was no longer dominance, but effectiveness within a larger system. By the late summer of 1944, this psychological transition was complete. British commanders no longer measured success by how closely operations matched pre-war doctrine. They measured it by results. Normandy had delivered results at a scale that redefined expectations. The invasion did not diminish Britain's contribution, but it clarified the limits of what Britain could carry alone. And that clarity shaped every Allied operation that followed. Normandy was not only a battlefield, it was a mirror. For British commanders, what they saw reflected back was not failure, but transition. A war that Britain had entered alone in 1939 had become something far larger by 1944, an industrial contest measured in divisions, tonnage, and endurance as much as in strategy and courage. The admissions that followed the invasion were not confessions of weakness. They were acknowledgments of reality. Britain had mastered war under constraint. The United States had mastered war at scale. Normandy revealed that modern conflict, once it reached a certain intensity, favored those who could sustain pressure without pause. This did not erase the value of experience. British planning, deception, and coordination were essential to making the invasion possible. Without them, American power might never have been applied so decisively. But Normandy showed that experience alone could no longer carry the main weight of victory. What British commanders admitted, quietly and professionally, was that the future of warfare had arrived on the beaches of France. It was loud, costly, and relentless. It did not wait for perfect plans or ideal conditions. It advanced through disruption, absorbed lows, and kept moving. In Tatsens and Normandy marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The age of limited wars fought by exhausted empires gave way to conflicts shaped by industrial nations capable of mobilizing entire societies. The British understood this not because they were defeated, but because they were present watching, calculating, and learning. History often remembers victories in terms of flag